Good afternoon, good morning, participants, wherever you are on this 11th day of June, 2020. I want to welcome you to this webinar on the challenges facing the Eastern Mediterranean from an energy perspective, hosted by the Transatlantic Leadership Network. In the past year, the Transatlantic Leadership Network, in partnership with Brookings Institution, has produced two important publications: Algeria and Transatlantic Relations, and Europe, Whole and Free, Vision and Reality. Our third publication, Maritime Disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean, The Way Forward, is authored by Dr. Rudi Baroody, who is with us today on this webinar. I am pleased to announce that the Transatlantic Leadership Network later this summer will be launching a publication entitled Unheard Voices of the Next Generation Emergent Leaders in Libya. We have a great program for you today to bring you up to date on this compelling subject of energy development in the Eastern Mediterranean. Following this brief introduction, we will meet Dr. Rudi Baroody, one of the hydrocarbon industry's great specialists, who will introduce us to his just published book on the sea boundaries of the region. Controversies over these sea boundaries is one of the factors inhibiting the realization of potential gas discoveries and their impact in the region. Then we will hear from two important policymakers in the United States government for this fascinating and constantly evolving region. To conclude, we will hear from Dr. Charles Ellinas. Ambassador Jonathan Moore is a member of the Senior Foreign Service, and in March, he assumed his duties as Senior Bureau Official, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Oceans and International Environment and Scientific Affairs. Previously, Ambassador Moore served as Ambassador and Head of the Mission to Bosnia and Herzegovina for the Organization of Security Cooperation in Europe. His service in U.S. missions abroad includes Chargé d'Affaires at the embassy in Belarus and Deputy Chief of Mission at embassies in Namibia, Belarus, Bosnia, and Herzegovina. Kurt Donnelly, a member of the Senior Foreign Service, is the Department of State Bureau of Energy Resources Deputy Assistant Secretary for Energy Diplomacy. Now based in Washington, he most recently served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Belgrade. Some of his assignments include the U.S. mission to NATO, Afghanistan, Turkey, Hungary, Russia, and Germany. Dr. Charles Ellinas is currently the CEO of CNHC, which provides management and advisory services in the oil and gas and energy sector in Cyprus and the region. After 25 years, Dr. Ellinas was a director of Mott MacDonald and the managing director of the company's oil, gas, and petrochemical business worldwide. Dr. Ellinas is also a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Global Energy Center. Their contributions will be moderated by my colleague, Debra Cagan, Distinguished Energy Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. I want to remind you that we will be recording this on the record session, and the recording will be available on the Transatlantic Leadership Network website. The importance of the discovery of hydrocarbon resources in the Near East in the 1930s and the increase in the importance of hydrocarbon fuels as the result of the Second World War and the subsequent rapid development of industrialized economies cannot be overstated. The existence of these resources, however, was unbalanced geographically and led to disparities in development in the region. Hydrocarbon producers in the Arab Gulf region prospered while the more settled states of the Levant, including after 1948, the state of Israel, remained dependent on imported energy. As a result, the economic well-being was dictated by both the availability of those resources, which had at many times an important political component, as well as market forces, which determined the price paid for both current use as well as future development. Exploration in the Levant, specifically offshore in the Eastern Mediterranean, was pursued energetically. Positive results from these exploration efforts in the early years of the 21st century gave rise to expectations that finally, the crescent of states around the Eastern Mediterranean littoral would find greater economic opportunities and even greater security and stability. While some of these expectations have been realized, with the Leviathan and Zohr gas fields already up and running, others have been delayed because of politics and economics. Additionally, in the face of such vast new reserves of gas and the promise of huge economic benefit, states not part of these discoveries are scurrying to ensure that they will have access to abundant energy in the future. As we can already see how gas from Egypt and Israel has helped Jordan's economy, we have seen elsewhere in the world energy independence translates into economic growth and lessens the political influence of those who would use energy as a weapon. With that, I will turn to my colleague Debra Cagan to engage our distinguished panelists.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you join us today, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. We're going to turn to each of our panelists to give some brief opening remarks, and then we will pose some questions to them. And after that, we're going to open it up to the audience. So since Ambassador Craig has done a great job of introducing everyone, I'm going to turn to Dr. Rudi Baroody, the author of this tremendous book, and have him start us off today. Good afternoon. Dr. Baroody, would you please get us underway?
Good morning. First of all, I would like to thank Transatlantic Leadership Network for hosting this webinar even during these trying times, and I hope all of the good health to all of our colleagues and to all of the people that are enduring this bad virus. Now, on the book, I want to thank this fantastic panel. And I would like to thank you all for being there, some from home, some from work. The research I have been, first of all, I am from Lebanon, and I've been reading and studying the Euromed for the last 40 years. It's a sea of 2.5 million square kilometer with 450 million people. Now, those 21 countries that share the Mediterranean, they have only 16 treaties in place, including the one that was signed a couple of days ago between Greece and Italy. This region, especially the East Med, they used to, except for Egypt, they used to import most of their fossil fuels. And now they have a nice platform with science and law to be able to divide and to have a clean, unbiased, equal distance, exclusive economic zone partition among all of them, from Greece to Turkey, Syria, Cyprus, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt too. Now, having said that, today's science can give us a 10-meter photography. Now, for example, in the 90s, when Cyprus and Egypt started their delineation, they used to do it up in the old imperial graphics cartography. Today, if we use the technology, they will have even more state-of-the-art geography done. However, in the 1990s, there was no GPS to be used. And with this wealth that is in Zohar, for example, or Leviathan, or Cosmos and all, this will give a lot of freedom to the countries to have more hydrocarbons for their own use, for their power plants, use less coal power plant, and they will be able to assist more in social health care, education, and welfare for the nations. We are talking for the time being as estimated around 200 to 250 billion USD only from whatever they have already assessed there. And I am sure we need, as among all, the US to assist the nations that are not accepting yet the United Nations Law of the Sea, since all of the nations of the EastMed and Euromed, they are all party to the United Nations Charter. They are all parties to the EU Euromed of Barcelona and Trieste. And I'm sure the US can definitely help, especially the State Department, as an honest broker to bring the parties in. There is a book where we can all sit down and make peace for energy use. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Baroudi. Excellent points and a great synopsis of your tremendous book. I'd like to turn now to Ambassador Moore to make some brief remarks for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Pleased to have the opportunity, thanks to all who are part of this. As Debra, you have suggested, I will speak very briefly. I will look forward to deferring to my colleague Kurt Donnelly on the key energy elements here, but let me make some general points. First of all, I do welcome the opportunity to introduce people to the Bureau of Oceans International Environmental and Scientific Affairs. If you're not familiar with our work, we like to say we cover everything from the depths of the oceans to the vastness of space. We have tremendous responsibilities working environmental science, technology, and health issues, as well as space. We're seeing intersections between some of this now, where wildlife trafficking and trading has direct connections to the origins of pandemics, whether it's the most recent outbreak of Ebola just a few days ago in the Democratic Republic of the 11th outbreak there since 1976, or to COVID-19 and HIV and others. We have a huge number of issues we work with, including, of course, oceans and maritime issues. We're also very interested in watersheds and water quality. So it's a great opportunity. And again, I'm pleased to participate in this today in the context of all of that. One specific issue that we're already looking at with regard to the Eastern Mediterranean is marine debris and plastic waste, because plastic pollution continues to be a significant contributor to the decline of the health of the marine environment. Although the Mediterranean accounts for less than 1% of the world's ocean waters, it holds 7% of the microplastics. More than 200 million tourists in normal years, unfortunately this is not one of those, visit the Mediterranean shores, and the countries in the Mediterranean depend on tourism income and fisheries, as is known, extremely well. So we appreciate again the attention to the science and the environment that affects the context for these discussions. So far, unilateral actions have not been enough to address the threat to regional economy. posed by marine debris and plastic waste. We would like to see more joint efforts, and the spirit of broader cooperation in the Eastern Med is something obviously we would like to foster in any way that we can. With regard to boundary disputes, they obviously have created tensions for many years. Tensions among some states have intensified with efforts to explore for and exploit hydrocarbon resources in the region. The United States generally does not take a position on other states' maritime boundary disputes. We urge all states to resolve their maritime disputes peacefully and in accordance with international law. We encourage all parties to act with restraint and refrain from actions that increase tensions in this region and other regions. Energy resource development in the Eastern Mediterranean should foster cooperation among the neighbors and provide a foundation for durable energy security and economic prosperity. I'll leave that there. Happy to talk more about some of the things that we're doing with regard to maritime disputes in other regions that are illustrative examples, but to keep things going and to give the opportunity for questions, I'll end my opening remarks there. Debra, back over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Moore. Appreciate those opening comments, and I think it's good for everyone who's webbing into us today to understand exactly what your Bureau does. And although I spent a lot of time in the State Department, I wasn't even clear on all of those aspects, so thank you for that. So I'd like to turn now to Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly to talk to us a little bit about where the Bureau of Energy Resources is at on these issues, where the U.S. government is headed, and just your general views on the East Mediterranean exploration for natural resources. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Debra. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Thanks, Debra, for hosting this event. Thanks, Ambassador Craig, for the nice introduction. And thanks to the Transatlantic Leadership Network for your leadership on this really important issue. As you can imagine, it is a very important issue for my bureau, the Bureau of Energy Resources at the Department of State. We have 5 priority issues, policy issues, efforts in my bureau, and the Eastern Mediterranean is one of those. So we invest a lot of time and effort in understanding the developments in the region and promoting those positive developments because we see it as an important means of improving energy diversification and growth, but also improving political cooperation in the region. Let me congratulate Dr. Baroudi for your book. It's an honor to be on the panel with you. In the Eastern Med, we work very closely with the countries of the Eastern Med. We have very, very strong working relationships with a number of countries on these issues. Other countries are not quite in a place to participate and cooperate, but we still maintain dialogue with them, constantly encouraging them to take the right path of cooperation rather than confrontation. I was in Cairo in January for the Eastern Med Gas Forum, a really significant new development in the region. Minister El-Molla, Steinitz, Hatzidakis, and Lakotripis were all there, the members of the Eastern Med Gas Forum. It was my first chance to join that group, and I was really impressed by the easy cooperation and conversations among these ministers on sometimes difficult issues, and their commitment to moving forward on issues that bring benefits to all their countries. So it was a very impressive initiative, and I should remind folks that this was an initiative of these countries. This is not something that the U.S., as we sometimes do, has a great idea and goes out and puts together these kinds of things. The Eastern Med Gas Forum was created by these countries because they recognize the opportunities ahead of them, and they recognize the importance of very, very high-level cooperation among these countries if they're going to achieve their goals in the region. U.S. vision for the region is one that is peaceful, productive, and embraces the positive development of energy resources in the Eastern Med. We want our partners to prosper from energy development. We want to see the resources in the Eastern Med contribute to energy security, not just for the members who have the energy resources, but for other countries in the region to benefit from these new sources of energy. The region is fortunate that they have the components to really make this work. Thriving energy sector, significant natural resource endowment, as we're learning as exploration goes on, dynamic and growing markets among them, and a good framework of production and infrastructure, which will help with future development. But I think we'll get to this probably later, but in even prior to COVID-19 and the reduction of demand, the energy market's a tough market. It's very, very competitive now. And especially in areas like natural gas with the emergence of LNG and a number of other producers, gas prices are very, very competitive. And so those are some of the challenges that the region has to deal with. And I think it would be good if we talk about some of the things that the countries in the region can do to make themselves more competitive. Certainly, Egypt, Israel, and Jordan are already benefiting from the cooperation among themselves. Certainly, Jordan has benefited tremendously, and we're happy to see that. It's the cooperation among the countries that we were so interested in promoting and development. In addition to the Eastern Med Gas Forum, who we are not members of, but we've been invited to some meetings, and there may be an opportunity for us to be an adjunct member of that body at some point. But our primary mechanism in the Eastern Med right now on a diplomatic level is the 3+1 mechanism. And that includes, of course, the United States is the one, and Greece, Cyprus, and Israel is the other three. And this is a really dynamic, forward-leaning group at the most senior level, working to find in cooperative ways to promote development in the Eastern Med on a number of issues, but most importantly, in our view, the energy issue is really front and center. The energy security of these countries is very important to us. So we look at important partners: Jordan, Israel, Greece, Cyprus, Egypt. Energy security is vital. Debra mentioned that briefly, how important energy security is for countries to reduce the impact of the energy weapon, which is used by some countries in the region. But it's not just the energy security of the Eastern Med, it's also this development contributes to the energy security of other countries. New sources of natural gas contribute to enhanced competition, which means better service, better prices, more choices for countries on where they want to get their gas resources and what suits their national imperatives the best. So this is very important, and we see this as an important development. The Eastern Med is important to our Congress. In December, our Congress passed the Eastern Med Security and Energy Partnership Act. So we have that support coming from our Congress. So there's a lot of positive effort in the U.S. government on focusing on the developments in the Eastern Med and doing what we can to support that and contribute to it. I guess that's all I have to say now. Look forward to the questions, and thanks again, Debra and TLN, for hosting this event.
Thank you, Kurt, and thank you for preempting some of my questions. But no, that was a great tour d'horizon of where the Energy Bureau is at and where the U.S. government is at. And thank you for mentioning the bill that was signed into law in December of last year on this, because that's a critically important thing, and it shows that over every branch of government there is support for this development in the Eastern Mediterranean. With that, I want to turn to Dr. Ellison, who is going to chat with us from some of the commercial perspective on that, and I welcome you to have your opening remarks.
Can you hear me? Again, thank you, Debra. Thank you, everybody. A good introduction by everybody. Given my background, I will talk more about the techno-economic aspects of development of East Med gas. As you probably know, in terms of exploration and production, the East Med is at a standstill due to the postponement of activities by the international oil companies. They are in a state of crisis due to oversupply of oil and gas and subdued demand due to the impact of coronavirus on the global economies. The impact of this on the East Med is that COVID-19 not only has led to cancellation of drilling for gas, but also has affected gas development in general. The global gas industry was in trouble due to overproduction of gas and LNG much before COVID-19. The pandemic has made it worse. The economies of all countries around the East Med have been affected badly by COVID-19, and recovery will be challenging. But that has not stopped political turmoil. If anything, during these last few weeks, it has come back with vengeance. And the key issue remains EEZ disputes. And this is where Dr. Baroody's book is quite timely. Central to these disputes is the Memorandum of Understanding signed last November between Turkey and Libya on delimitation of the maritime jurisdiction areas between the two countries. This was followed last week by the publication of a map by Turkey showing 24 blocks for exploration as close as 6 nautical miles from Greek islands such as Rhodes and Crete. The Greek Foreign Minister, Nikos Dendias, said last week that Greece was and remains fully prepared to deal with this provocation if Turkey decides to implement it. The risk of conflict is increasing. These actions add another front to the increasing number of areas of confrontation between Greece and Turkey, and Turkey and Cyprus at a time when both countries should be concentrating their efforts on how to recover from the devastating impact of the pandemic on their economies. Only dialogue based on the United Nations law of the seas can resolve this, not force. But I'm sure we'll discuss it further later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comments and raising issues that I think are on everyone's mind, but we're all trying to be careful to be cooperative here. And yes, I think we all agree that peaceful resolution of these things are the way to go. That these countries are never going to realize their full potential if conflict is the watchword instead of peaceful resolution. Thank you for all of our panelists for your opening remarks. And I'm going to take moderator's prerogative and open it up with questions for each of our panelists. But before I do that, I'd like to remind our substantial audience today who's joining us from all over the world, please start submitting your questions because we will have time to get to questions from the audience. And the sooner you submit them, the higher they're going to go up on the priority list. So we encourage you to submit your questions. And when you do that, please, if you would, identify yourself and whether you're representing any organization. That would also be useful so we can talk about that when we ask our panelists the questions. Thank you very much. With that, I'd like to turn to Dr. Baroudi. In addition to your extensive research and thorough discussion of territorial waters and economic zones, you've also written about what I consider one of the most extremely important subjects of energy diversity and independence that both you and Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly have talked about. Many in our audience today are committed to ensuring that countries have been so reliant on energy imports, often from just a single or very few sources, have the opportunity to change the dynamic for themselves. When countries are spending 60 to 70% of their GDP on energy imports, there has to be a better way to free up those assets for more important development in those countries. And so I think the development of gas flows from the Leviathan and Jor gas plays have a way to fundamentally change the dynamic in these countries. And as we know, there are still almost 900 million people in this world who have no access to electricity. And that problem alone is significant because it means less women and children can go to school, can change their dynamic because they spend all their time gathering fuel for fires, for cooking. It means less resources to educate underserved and disenfranchised members of society. And so one of the most exciting things about these energy flows coming online is how it's going to affect this. And so, Dr. Baroudi, may I ask that you talk a little bit, as you did in your book, about how the dynamic effect this will have in terms of employment, education, and even access to regular electricity versus sometimes there, sometimes not there. How do you think it will affect these countries, and whether you think this will contribute to stability, not only in this region, but within the individual countries themselves?
Debra, thank you very much for a long but very interesting question. First of all, most of the East Med, except for Egypt, that has an oil and gas industry that is as old as 120, 125 years old, all of the other nations were almost 90 and 97% dependent on importing the fossil fuel. Now, with this wealth in Zohar, Leviathan, Plistos, and all, and the future to come will definitely help most of the region, their dependency on fossil fuel, and that will relieve them from the burdens of this big budget for each countries that we have there. You have to remember that the East Med, they needed a lot of assistance and foreign aid in order to do all of the minimum requirement for social support. Now, this wealth, once they will have, and they will have it for their own use and for their export, will definitely assist social security, healthcare, education, and one of them is, like you are saying, the sustainable electricity at a very reasonable cost. But also the most important thing, this wealth will fight poverty. And poverty is the only way to fight terrorism. Terrorism, unfortunately, within the region is ramping everywhere. And the terrorism is coming because of our poverty. Now, like Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly said, and Ambassador Moore said about the rights of fishery and all. Now, the Mediterranean, they have almost 23 active volcanoes. They have 44 dormant. And what do we know? And I am sure Ambassador Moore knows more, that all of the residues from volcanoes, they have a lot of minerals like manganese, gold, nickel, etc. So it is not just the fishery wealth, it is not only the oil and gas wealth, it's also the minerals that are there. And with the use of law in a very peaceful way, in a very diplomatic way, with a dialogue, this will assist the whole countries of the region to solve their problems in a peaceful way and according to the United Nations law of the book, since they are all participants there. But I still I believe that some countries need an excellent mediator like the State Department to come and assist. Alone, they will not do this. And I am sure at a later time, I will be able to show a map that Dr. Ellinas has shown about the Turkey-Libyan line. I do have a slide that I can show you if you wish. Thanks, Debra.
Thanks, Dr. Baroudi. And I'm going to ask, because you're right, this was a long series of questions, and I want to invite our other panelists to comment on this. I'll ask first, Ambassador Moore, do you have anything to say, to add to what Dr. Baroudi has said here?
Specifically on that, no, I find this a useful discussion and learning process. There are, we can get into this a little later, there are many aspects to where maritime boundaries lie and how they're defined. It should be a cooperative process, exactly as Dr. Baroudi said. There are implications on many levels, not just for energy resources.
Thank you, Ambassador Moore. So Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly or Dr. Ellison or Ambassador Craig, do you want to pipe up and add anything to this conversation? I'd like this to be not only me asking questions and getting answers, but a more integral discussion among our esteemed panelists, because it's rare that we get you all together in this sort of environment.
Debra, maybe I can say just a couple quick things. The emphasis on access to electrical power, I think, is really incredibly important. And it's one of the primary objectives of what we do at State Department Energy Bureau. But we're in an era when we can actually solve these problems. And it's a huge issue for development and fighting poverty, which is so important in our world right now. But we also have growing economies and rapidly growing populations. So we've got to do better than just holding our own. We've got to really do more to extend access to power to all populations in the world. And the good news is we're in an era of energy abundance. It causes problems because it drives prices down and changes investment decisions, but we have the oil, we have the natural gas, we have the ability to take advantage of these resources at low prices. And so it makes the decisions for countries a little bit easier because they have options now. If they're committed to providing, increasing the amount of electricity to their populations, they have a number of options. And when we talk about energy abundance, it's just not that there's more gas and oil available to countries. There's an abundance of choices. So renewable energy now is much more competitive. In some places, it makes much more sense to use renewable energy rather than to build yourself a gas-powered power plant. So in that sense, we're quite optimistic about the opportunities there. The real issue, I shouldn't go off on this too much, but the real issue is to get the investment money. This is not, these investments are not going to be financed by the governments themselves. They're not even going to be financed by development banks like the World Bank and others, although they play a critical role. The investment is going to come from private companies. And so that opens up a whole slew of issues about how you can ensure that private companies are looking to invest in these new opportunities, which have such positive benefits for us and people around the world.
Okay, is there anyone else on our panel who would like to comment on this?
No, I'd like to briefly say that one of the factors that we often ignore when we talk about East Med gas, especially in the region, is the impact of what Ambassador Donnelly said about the global markets and prices. And global markets and prices are very challenging. And without the private companies coming in to invest under this challenging environment, it's going to be very difficult to develop oil and gas in the East Med. And if on top of that, we have all these regional disputes, increasing risk, it makes it that much more difficult. So these are the issues we need to really grapple with if we want to see this gas developed and going somewhere so that we can benefit. But on top of that, the renewables are abundant, and yet we're not making good use of that. And that's perhaps where we need some help to convince the region that investment in renewables will pay, not just in gas. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's a perfect segue into the next question I'd like to pose to Ambassador Moore in particular. We've had a lot of discussion here about law of the sea, which is a very incredibly complicated area of international law. And those of us who have served in official roles with our governments know that it's been the hard way for us to understand just how many things can happen, how many minor infractions can happen on the high seas that turn into huge issues for countries and sometimes into conflict. And so recently, Secretary Pompeo issued a statement that I understand, Ambassador Moore, you and your team were instrumental in putting out there about the South China Sea, which I believe refers not only to freedom of navigation, but to exploitation of resources in territorial waters. Could I ask for you to please walk us through the practical aspects of this and what it means for official U.S. policy, and also how you think this U.S. policy on the South China Sea might apply to the Eastern Mediterranean?
Debra, thank you very much for the question. I appreciate the opportunity. You've been kind in referring to our team. It was a joint effort, of course, throughout the U.S. government to put this policy forward. We found this very important to do from the Secretary and, of course, through our ambassador to the UN in New York, Kelly Craft. Basically, it comes down to this, and I'm going to look away from the screen so I can read it to you in detail. But the People's Republic of China claims waters and asserts rights, including vaguely described historic rights, in a way which is plainly inconsistent with the law of the sea convention. The PRC further seeks to interfere with the lawful exercise of navigation rights and freedoms. So Secretary Pompeo's statement urged all UN member states to uphold international law and freedom of the seas. Our protest note to the UN focused on the impact of the PRC's maritime claims on the rights and freedoms of the United States and all maritime states. That said, we remain concerned about the PRC's pattern of intimidation and bullying tactics against other South China Sea claimants, as well as PRC interference with longstanding practices concerning offshore gas and oil resources. These disputes, as in all cases around the world, need to be resolved peacefully without coercion or the threat or use of force, and in accordance with international law. And so in this sense, as you've asked, the approach that we take on the South China Sea, of course, applies as well to Eastern Mediterranean disputes. They should be resolved peacefully without coercion or the threat or use of force, and in accordance with international law. Provocative actions that raise tensions in the region should be avoided. And I would say this is a further point we in the US government and in this administration have been pleased to clarify, again, in the context of the South China Sea, but it applies to the Eastern Med as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Moore. And Dr. Baroudi, you mentioned that you need U.S. leadership to resolve some of these disputes in the Eastern Mediterranean. Do you see what Ambassador Moore has just talked about in this issuance of the statement by Secretary Pompeo in the context of the UN as a good stepping stone for how we then proceed in the Eastern Mediterranean?
I believe, and I am confident, the only nation that can help bring parties together, especially in the East Med, is the US. The European Commission, unfortunately, has been absent for the last 4 or 5 years due to many factors, financial factors, COVID-19, the leadership. And I appreciate that the EU did a lot for the Euromed, but the absence of a leadership needs the US to come in and help. Nobody can come and talk to the elephant in the garden, if I can say, except the US. whether it is Turkey, Cyprus, Turkey, Greece, Israel, Lebanon. This is the only platform that we can have and do that. And if you can see, the wells that we have in the East Med now happen to be beautifully in two nations where they have the law of the sea, EEZ zone signed. Cyprus and Egypt, where they have the joint fields, and Israel and Cyprus, they have signed their fields, and it is only there. So among these East Med, the only two nations that they have signed it, we have those wells there. So let us at least ask the US to come back. And I am sure the US, they have appointed, if I'm not mistaken, Deputy Secretary Fannin to do this job, and they have done a lot, and we need more to finalize the last mile that we need to do. Everybody needs to tap to this. Everybody needs oil and gas. Everybody needs electricity, as Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly said. And we need to live in peace. And I am sure the US can help us to do this. Otherwise, nobody is coming to go and talk to the president here or to the prime minister's sister there. We need an honest, strong facilitator.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baroudi. I'd like to turn back to some of the commercial aspects that have been mentioned before. Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly, you've talked about making these countries more competitive. We know, based on you and Dr. Ellinas, that there has been, because of the excessive glut in the market, that things are more competitive now, that prices are very low, that some of the spot markets in Europe are much lower than even the cost of transit of gas, which does not make it a very profitable endeavor in terms of export. But even in a very perfect political world, the market is going to have an appropriately outsized role in exploration, extraction, delivery to consumers. And because of this unprecedented free fall in prices and the glut due to lowering consumption because of the pandemic, because of COVID-19. So, companies are looking at this and they are looking at further, what are they going to do on further exploration and development? So the key question here is, you already have two high producing gas plays that are contributing greatly to changing the dynamic of consumption of countries in the region and how this changes their budgets and their ability to spend on other important things in their economies. Do you think that for now, the companies are going to sort of stand pat with what they have? I think companies frequently refer to this as stage one. And just for the next foreseeable year or so, stick with things that are easier and putting off the more difficult things, the more difficult stages, further exploration and extraction, until prices show a rebound. What are your takes on this? And I pose this question to both of you.
So thanks, Debra. Yes, the answer to a lot of what you talked about is yes. Just a number, the IEA estimates that global energy investment this year will contract by 20%. That's 1/5 of investment. That's an enormous sum of money that they don't expect is going to be invested. And there's good reason for that. Much of it is COVID-19. The demand for energy is falling because our economies are in retraction and recession. These are companies. They have to make decisions about looking at all the factors that contribute to those decisions. They have to make the decisions, present them to their boards and say, yeah, we still think we can make money. This is a good decision to take. And right now, there's a pullback on that, and it's quite understandable. The issue in the Eastern Med, so that's worldwide. And we're seeing that happen in the United States, where a booming oil industry is taking a step back. We're seeing that in Asia. We're seeing that in all across the globe. In particular, in the Eastern Med, the economics have always been challenging. These have always been close decisions about exploiting the energy resources in the region. But companies went ahead, and those decisions proved to be quite beneficial. So they've proved the concept that exploiting them, especially the gas resources in the Eastern Med, with the cooperation of some of the countries in the region, is a viable business plan. Conditions have changed, and so just as across the globe, 20% of investment in energy is expected to be off the table. That is also going to be felt in Eastern Med investment as well. So I think we're going to see that. That's just talking about commercial terms. What I think is equally important, probably in the Eastern Med, even a lot more important, and I think Dr. Baroudi, you've sort of alluded to a lot of this, is the political risk. So these companies are looking at commercial risk, and there's lots of factors that are fairly knowable and predictable. Political risk is a difficult one. And I think that's why you saw so much development of energy resources in the United States over the last 4 or 5 years. Even though it's not the cheapest place to produce energy, companies were saying it's the best place because the political environment was stable, our regulatory system was conducive to these investments. This is a problem for countries and regions all over the world. How do you create the right investment climate, and how do you reduce the political risk? And of course, the actions by Turkey in the Mediterranean have increased that political risk, and it does have a cost. That is why the cooperation of the Eastern Med Forum, the cooperation of the 3+1 initiative to counterbalance, to signal to investors that there is stability, there is cooperation in the region, it isn't all about political risk, is so very important. And of course, the issue of the South China Sea is, I think, educational for us on this. It is a two-sided strategy by the Chinese, and one of those strategies is to heighten the political risk in the South China Sea, so that companies feel less secure about making those investments. It's an insidious policy that China's pursuing, but it has that effect. And in this time of low prices and economic recession, it becomes all the more potent.
Do we want to hear, any of our other panelists want to comment on this?
Yeah, Debra, can I say, make a comment, and then I think Dr. Ellinas can follow up. But one aspect that we haven't talked about is the actual cost of developing the fields in the gas fields in the Eastern Mediterranean. In both the case of Israel and Egypt, the costs are very high. In Egypt, the gas is under approximately 1.4 kilometers of sea and seabed. And in Israel, which produces quite a bit of its electricity by coal, the exploitation of those of the gas resources has the effect of increasing the cost of energy internally, no matter what the price, no matter what the international price is. So in both Egypt and Israel, regardless of what's going on the price internationally, it becomes a challenge. It is a challenge because of the high cost of production to integrate those gas resources into the national economy. Dr. Ellinas, maybe you can follow that up.
Yes, I'd like to. I mean, the greatest problem, you're absolutely right. The cost of production is very high in the East Med. And in Israel, in Cyprus, the water depth is about 2,000 meters, and the reservoirs lie something like 4,000 meters below that. So it's a long way to go down. Even one well to drill costs about $100 million. And producing that gas is expensive. So exporting it, for example, to Europe, where there is a lot of effort being put into, it's a challenge, because for that gas to find markets in Europe, no matter how it goes there, either through a pipeline or as LNG, prices must be of the order of $7 to $8 per million BTU per 1,000 cubic feet in Europe to make it commercially viable. I don't see prices in Europe ever reaching that level, and that makes it very, very difficult. And that's why I said before that the prospects lie in the domestic markets. So even though producing the gas is a little bit expensive, can cost about $2, $2.50, $3 sometimes, taking it to the local market, the cost may be below $4. And given that in Egypt, for example, the price of gas is of the order of $6, it makes it commercially viable. It can benefit, the country can benefit. And Israel is the same. Israel was burning coal and heavy fuel oil. Coal is a pollution problem. Heavy fuel is expensive. Taking gas from Tamar and Leviathan has been very, very good for Israel. And the intention is to move more and more into gas and completely eliminate coal within a few years. And renewables. Both Egypt and Israel are investing heavily in renewables. This is where the future lies in regional markets, but we come back to the same problems again. To develop shouldn't forget that a huge market in the region is Turkey. A huge gas market is Turkey. How do you unlock that market? How do you unlock the regional markets? For that, we need to eliminate the problems, through dialogue, find a way to remove these disputes. And we will discuss that a bit later. I have some ideas. I have something to say a bit later on.
Excellent, Dr. Ellinas. Thank you very much. And that segues into sort of the last question I want to ask. And some of the questions coming in from our audience sort of are in this same vein. We talked about the prospects for exports and a lot of investment being put into looking at exports into the European market. And Doug Hengel from LNG Allies in the United States also wants to look at, does this sort of still make sense here? And so the last question is, with gas at the prices that it is in Europe right now, with liquefied gas storage in Europe 75% filled and an expectation that it'll be 100% filled by July, the end of July, does this justify looking at exploration in the Eastern Med is really finding a market in Europe, considering that there are other countries who already have a significant market share in Europe who are dominating that market, and a wide diversity of resources going in there between Russia, Norway, the United States, Nigeria, Algeria, and others, even the Dutch until recently. So that's another question I have for our panelists about, should the focus really be more on what you can do domestically, or do you think it's worth the while, maybe not in this current economic environment, but maybe in an economic environment that changes a year from now, after we look at quarterly earnings, to look at this being a realistic export market for East Mediterranean gas? And then the other piece I put onto this is, are there other markets that outside of the East Mediterranean in Europe that might make sense for this export? And I say this in light of the discussion on renewables. I think we all still see gas as a great transition source of energy that will have another 20 to 30 years. Even the International Energy Agency refers to that. Certainly the European Union refers to that. And We know that the European Union has invested heavily into gas pipelines and interconnectors. And we've seen in the United States a precipitous drop in hydrocarbon emissions in many states that have transitioned from coal to both gas and nuclear. So I put that out there and ask all of the panelists to express a view on that if you have one, and looking at that distinction between domestic consumption and the export market.
Can I comment on that, Debra?
Absolutely.
Okay. First of all, the East Med gas is to to be self-sufficient to the countries in the East Med. Now, the East Med export options, like Dr. Ellinas said, it could be pipelines, it could be by LNG and all. Now, we have to remember that Europe, they have the natural consumption is around 470 billion cubic meter. Now, the East Med pipeline has been designed with a 10 billion cubic meter capacity. So we are talking about 18 to 20%. So the East Med gas pipeline is a supplementary gas for the EU, but it is not something that we will call a major game changer. Now, having said that, like Dr. Ellinas said, the cost, the price will be the only item that where IOCs will decide whether this is a good investment or not. Like Undersecretary Donnelly said, it is the private companies that are going to invest. It is not the Cyprus or Lebanon or Israel or Egypt. It's basically the Exxon, the ENI, the Total that are going to finance this through their own balance sheet. I do see the market to come up when the economies will reopen after the COVID-19. We will see that the consumption that was before the COVID-19 around 97 million barrels per day. Today, we are hovering around 75. So like you have said, 20% of the IAA prospects or investment that are going to be brought down for 2020, this will come up, especially when we look at that the world whole population is almost going to get into 8 billion people by next year. So the world is still going to need fossil, but it also need green. So, that's my small comment for Europe lines. Thank you.
Any of other panelists would like to comment on this? So seeing no volunteers,
Yes.
I'd like to pose, is there a yes there that I missed?
Yeah, I was going to say something about, there is something we haven't talked about. We're talking about gas exports to Europe. And we haven't talked about Europe's decision to drive the Green Deal. Green Deal means net zero emissions by 2050. And that is actually happening. And the impact of that is to reduce gas demand. So if you look at projections of the impact of the Green Deal on gas, by 2030, gas demand in Europe will actually drop by about 15%. And by 2050, it will drop by 80%. So gas in Europe is going to be a very difficult thing to sell because there are already supplies more than covering the gas needs of Europe, to the extent that Klaus Borchardt, the Deputy Director General of the European Commission, said that gas has a future in Europe, but only for another 10 years. Beyond that, it will be renewables and green energy. And he went as far as to say, between now and then, Europe has all the gas it needs, and it does not need any more large import gas pipelines. So that limits basically Europe. Not only is expensive to send the gas to Europe, but it limits Europe as a market. It leaves Asia, and as Rudi said, because of increasing population, aspirations for better standards of living, Asia's gas demand is increasing, and it will carry on increasing. Yesterday, the International Energy Agency released its annual gas report, and it shows that gas demand in Asia will carry on increasing. But everybody, absolutely everybody, is trying to sell their gas to Europe. And we shouldn't forget the shale gas, associated gas in the United States. That has had a huge impact on global markets. It has increased LNG capacity of the United States dramatically, and it's trying to find export markets. And these export markets are in Asia. Qatar, which produces the cheapest LNG in the world, is about to expand this capacity dramatically between now and 2025, 2027. All of that is trying to get into Asia. That's why prices are always going to be a challenge. And that's why I believe we should be concentrating on regional markets, on renewables, and not wasting a lot of our time, a lot of hot steam pushing for these global markets.
I appreciate that, but I just want to say one thing, and Deputy Assistant Secretary Donnelly might comment on this too. Those of us who have spent many years dealing with the European Union and statements and their implementation or lack thereof, we think these are very lofty goals on renewables, but we also know a significant number of EU members are pushing back on those numbers and those deadlines, a significant number of countries. We know that Germany is burning a huge amount of coal and has had an increase of about 15% in their hydrocarbon emissions over the last couple of years because of their precipitous walk away from nuclear power. We know that a number of other EU members are still burning a huge amount of coal. We know that in the United States, we've already achieved a significantly lower number of emissions than many parts of Europe has. So I am not as optimistic, and again, I'm using my role as moderator to make a comment here. I'm not as optimistic that Europe will meet these goals in as rapid as a fashion as some have predicted. And indeed, others have talked about companies who were using their profits from oil and gas to invest heavily in renewables, and some of that investment now is being pulled back. Kurt, do you have any comments on
that? Yeah, just quickly, certainly agree with that. I think that the EU has set itself incredible goals and targets that will be difficult to achieve. We wish them well. The United States wants to help them with that process if we can. But it's hard to predict what the energy demand and the energy mix is going to be in 30 years. We can come up with some general ideas, and there's certainly strong trends that we expect to continue. But the fact of the matter is that I represent a government, and we're talking about governmental decisions, and the real decisions are going to be made by corporations. And they have very, very talented staffs of people who are testing the economic winds and understand the markets so fundamentally better than we do, because this is what they get paid to do all the time, every day. And it's up to them to make the decisions. And some of them will make wrong decisions. And in a free market economy, the price of making wrong decisions sometimes is you go out of business, and other companies will make the right decisions. And in the end, because of that free market basis, which the global energy market is becoming more and more competitive and operate on free market terms, we get the best outcome. And we get the best outcome that suits our needs, because individual companies are making the decisions that are best for them. And in aggregate, it's best for the global economy when they have that ability to do that. When we try and centrally plan something, we almost always miss the mark, and then we have to scramble to try and make up for our mistakes. This is the beauty of a competitive market economy. And I think that the LNG revolution that we've seen in the past years has turned the natural gas market into a much more competitive, much more market-based energy sector, which is positive for everyone. And if that means that Eastern Med gas resources are not really competitive in Europe right now, that's what the market will dictate, and companies will make decisions based on that, whether they want to invest developing the resources and the infrastructure to get it to Europe. They're going to take a hard look at that, and if they don't think it makes financial sense, they're not going to do it. These are valuable resources. How they can be used is something that we're going to learn over the years. But again, as governments, we're not trying to put our finger on the scale to promote one or the other. Our sort of motto is all of the above. All energy sources are on the table, and each individual country, each individual region has a different mix that meets its needs. And that changes over time as conditions change.
And I want to follow up from another of our audience members said, in light of the slowdown and the prospects of exporting to the European market, does the 3+1 process still make sense? Shouldn't more attention be given to cooperation with Egypt and Jordan and not just with the 3+1 countries? And now that we have you on the screen, I guess this is perfect for you.
The 3+1 is not just about promoting energy among those countries. It's a lot more. What we're finding is that because energy is so central to the economic health and development of countries, it's a really good issue for us to talk to other countries about, to find areas of cooperation, common understanding. And that's what the 3+1 is about. And we'll continue to do very positive things that not only contributes to strengthening our political and economic relationships with these countries, but also putting forth a model for how cooperation in the region brings benefits to everyone. Because we have models of cooperation, 3+1 and the Eastern Med Gas Forum, as I noted, and we have instances of non-cooperation. The conflict over demarcating exclusive economic zones in the Eastern Med. So the 3+1 is a positive model, and as long as it contributes to our national interest and to the development, stability, and security of the countries in the region, we'll continue to support it and take part in it and make it a priority.
Thank you very much. I want to turn now to another question from our audience, from one of our well-known energy writers in the business, Emily Meredith with Energy Intelligence. And Emily asks about, does the pause in investment give an opportunity to address political risk, or is it more likely that the economic drivers for hashing out a political arrangement, particularly with Turkey, just fall away? And are the panelists generally pessimistic about a solution right now than they were maybe 6 months ago? And then another important question she asked, which I'm going to raise since we've talked about China here with Ambassador Moore. How will U.S. energy compete with China's Belt and Road Initiative in the region regarding energy development? I didn't promise easy questions, so this is a excellent window here for all of you to comment on this. Kurt, do you want to start?
So I guess the first question was about a solution with Turkey and some of the conflict over delimiting sea boundaries. Are we more pessimistic? I don't know. I think that when you're involved in foreign affairs, you have to be very, very realistic. But the problem is, if you're very, very realistic, it's hard to get up in the morning. So you have to be an optimist. You have to hope that what you're doing is going to lead to a better solution. And so I think that's the posture we take. I don't think there's any reason to expect that suddenly this is all going to be cleared up. Dr. Baroudi has made some proposals in his book, which are important to study. But we're going to continue to look at ways that we can help this process, because we see it as negative for the region, for energy development, for cooperation in the region, for all sorts of things. And so, but can I say that objectively there's reasons for optimism? No, probably not. But I don't think that just because there aren't doesn't mean that we're not optimistic that we will find a way and that there will be a peaceful resolution of these issues. The second question, Debra, was
on the about the U.S. competing with China's Belt and Road Initiative and how that affects the prospects for others in that region.
I think Jonathan probably a lot closer to this issue, but I guess I would just point out that again, you have two competing models. You have the Chinese model of coercion and threat and state-dominated investment and all the rest. We have a different model of open and free markets where nations and companies get to make choices who they partner with, who they buy their energy from, how they develop it in the best interests of their country and their consumers and customers. We bring open best practices in the commercial realm, transparency, anti-corruption, bringing expertise. So I think this brings in very sharp relief the difference in the two models that China and we are presenting to the world, at least in this area of energy development.
Does anyone else want to comment on these questions?
I'll add to that if I may, Debra.
Please.
I think Curtis hit exactly the nail on the head. There is this direct contrast and clash between open, credible, trusting, and frankly, private sector driven ideas and opportunities, and a state-run apparatus called Belt and Road in some cases and other things in others, that is all about asserting more control for the People's Republic of China, of manipulating and misusing much of the rules and organizations in the multilateral world, of creating debt traps, of making empty promises and raising the price and building projects and undertaking work, in many cases with severely negative environmental impacts, in the name of helping countries and in actual fact not doing so. This is a comprehensive issue any number of us are dealing with. There are, again, as Kurt said, realities with regard to trading with the People's Republic of China, its footprint in the world. Unfortunately, it continues to be the world's worst polluter, the world's largest source of the plastics that are polluting our oceans. And at the same time, by engaging in a lot of practices that rules-bound countries like the United States do not engage in, to bribe and cajole and try to assert its authority. These are very formidable efforts, and they have impacts as well in the Eastern Med as they do throughout the world.
Thank you very much. I want to turn to another question. These are anonymous, so I can't give credit to those who have asked them. But for Dr. Baroudi and Dr. Ellinas, how has the importance of oil and gas resources in the area been socialized with the population on the ground? Dr. Baroudi, you've talked about advances in science and technology that can help resolve boundary disputes. And could you comment on further roles that science, technology, and science diplomacy could play in the region? And I see these two questions as sort of feeding into each other. So Dr. Baroudi, can I ask that you comment on this first?
Thank you. Well, first of all, as I said in the opening statement, that in the 90s, GPS did not exist. The satellite technologies did not exist for civilian use. In the year 2000 and the recently the last 4 or 5 years, the technology in satellite imagery and cartography, they can pin you down to almost a half a meter. Now, as you probably know, in the continuous zones where we have a problem, for example, between Turkey and Greece, especially on the Castellarizo island, it is now very easy, without even putting boots on the ground, to take exactly the imagery that we need to get into. For Israel and Lebanon, we can definitely do the same thing, because there is a difference in using the Nakura line and both lines for adjoining states. Now, with the technologies, we can define the land terminus points, as we have put in the books, using science and law according to the continuous zones and East and EEZ zones. So it is very now, I would say, even for the international court, they can sit down, bring the maps, they can ask each country to do a recent remapping of their coast, and whether we have an adjoining line, like between Cyprus and Lebanon, or Cyprus and Syria, or Cyprus and Turkey, they can still do the same thing. And if you allow me, Debra, there is a major point that my dear friend Charles Ellinas is Turkey is the largest consumer of all of the region there. If the region did not have any political skirmishes, now if I can say that, Turkey is 70 nautical miles from Cyprus, is 160 nautical miles from Israel fields. So I'm not saying that we should not build the East Med gas pipeline to Europe or send it by LNG, but if we want to sell our gas, and if there is no political skirmishes within the region, the Turkish capacity of natural gas is 50 billion cubic meter. So there is a big potential there if somebody could assist in resolving certain things. And as you probably know, 7-8 years ago, the US administration was facilitating or counseling or suggesting, why won't we send this gas up north? So we have the market there, the market is within the East Med, and the market is also there for Europe. So the prices, as Dr. Ellinas said, could go up and down. The market still needs that, especially if we are going to close down all of these dozens of coal power plants that are within the region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ellinas, do you have a quick comment on this, because we're rapidly running out of time here?
Yes, I have. Let me just say a few words about EEZ disputes. We have two major areas of dispute. One is Turkey and Cyprus, and that, I'm afraid, is highly political. The resolution is linked to solution of the Cyprus problem. The two go together. You cannot solve the EEZ dispute without solving the Cyprus problem. That is still a problem that is still not progressing. Hopefully after elections later in the year, we will move it forward. But the other one between Greece and Turkey is coming to a head. Turkey has made it clear that it intends to drill south of Crete in 3 to 4 months. And so far, Turkey always does what it says. When it plans something, it delivers. Greece has made it clear that it will not allow that to happen. And both the foreign minister and the defense minister have made announcements which are quite strong. And that is of concern to me. That can actually increase the risk of a hot incident. The recent agreement between Greece and Italy delineating their EEZs is the beginning of a process that perhaps should continue and eventually also bring together on the negotiating table Greece and Turkey. Back in December, the Greek Prime Minister said that he is quite prepared to sit and negotiate with Turkey, and if need be, refer the issue to the International Court of Justice at The Hague. And in January, the Turkish Foreign Minister confirmed that, yes, we would also be interested, and even though we don't like The Hague, if that is a last resort, we will consider it. COVID-19 came, all of that stopped the process. Maybe before the 3 or 4 months come, maybe it's time to bring this process back again. And the only entity that can achieve that, that can help bring these countries together is the United States, not Europe, United States.
Thank you very much. I'm not sure, I don't mean to cut you off, but we are really getting close to closure here. I want to take this opportunity, and I know our audience will virtually want to applaud our excellent panelists today. We've had a great conversation on what the lay of the land is in the Eastern Mediterranean, and also very frank conversation of what problems and difficulties have to be resolved so we can realize the full potential of this region. And I also want to encourage everyone to get Dr. Baroody's excellent book, and to and please get this we're now, because of the COVID, it's an ebook, but we encourage you to get this book and read it. We think you will find it both fascinating and informative. And again, please take a moment here to thank all of our excellent panelists today. And I personally want to thank all of you for spending a lot of your very precious time with us today. And again, I applaud all of you on behalf of our audience today. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Debra.
Thanks.
Many thanks.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.